Well, hello everyone. I'd like to introduce Holly Richter. Holly Richter, PhD, is the Upper San Pedro Program Director for the Nature Conservancy. She lives along the San Pedro and is focused on collaboration with many partners, including the Upper San Pedro Partnership and the Cochise Conservation and Recharge Network to enhance and protect the water needs of San Pedro for over 20 years. I've known her for 25, right? Let's see. Holly also launched the San Pedro River Wet Dry Mapping Program. That's one that's going on. They had it this June. Yeah, it's been going on forever. An annual citizen science monitoring program along the entire length of the river in both the U.S. and Mexico. And that still continues today. Well, I already said that. Let's see. Okay, get on the right page here. So Holly's going to speak on the hydrology of the San Pedro River, of San Pedro, a fascinating world of the hydrologic modeling, monitoring and research to keep the San Pedro flowing. The San Pedro River Basin is arguably one of the most studied watersheds in the Western U.S. This presentation will highlight some of the most interesting lessons learned about how water moves through the San Pedro watershed and its aquifer, and what is being done to ensure its current and future water needs are met to sustain this amazing habitat. So with that, Holly, thank you very much.
Yeah, it's a real honor to be here today. I'm wondering if we could dim these front lights just a little so that the slides look even prettier. Is that okay? Okay, thank you very much, appreciate that. Well, it's a great time of year to be talking about water in the San Pedro. Who's been out to the river this week? What'd you see? Lots of water?
Yeah, really. I drove it this morning and it's muddy.
Yeah.
Which means it's a lot of flow.
Cappuccino season, yeah.
Muddy, boggy, boogie, and froggy.
Yeah, it's always a really exciting, well, it's not always every monsoon an exciting year, because some years we get the non-soon instead of the monsoon, but it's my favorite time of the year because of the dynamics of the river and the water and all that happens in the floodplain. And frankly, there's very few rivers that remain undammed that have natural flooding processes like the San Pedro. That's one of the things that really sets it apart. Well, I should say there's very few rivers that still flow and are undammed, right? Especially in the desert Southwest. So that's a really amazing aspect of the river, and this is the perfect year and the perfect time of year to be seeing it.
Do you have a microphone?
They told me the microphone was in the ceiling.
Okay.
I can't believe that.
It wasn't yesterday.
Can you guys hear me?
Okay.
Yeah.
Just
all right, small room. Good. Yeah, no, and I have to admit, this is literally the first presentation I've given since COVID in person, and I feel like I have to make sure I'm like unmuted, you know? I mean, I'm so used to Zoom world, and this is like really different. Okay, anyway, here we go. That's interesting. Nice sound, but it's not moving my slides. Move the mouse and then do this?
I'll get him. Yeah, we need to. I was using.
Right, and he said to just do that. Like it is the complaint.
Yeah, but I was using this one.
Oh, let me try that one.
Hey.
Much better.
Is that the one?
Yeah, we're going with it. Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, it's this one and then this one, and then the markers there.
Okay. Alrighty, good. Alright, so we were just remarking how wonderful the flood flows are in the San Pedro, but they're only really half the story because the other thing that sustains it is the groundwater. And groundwater is very misunderstood and underappreciated in our world because we can't see it and we don't understand it. It's under our feet everywhere we go unless we're on bedrock rock, but we never think about that. I mean, it's moving under your feet right now towards the San Pedro. And so but it's not like when you dig into the earth and you see wet soil, that's not necessarily groundwater. Groundwater is down in the saturated zone way beneath. And so you've heard about the water table, right? The water table is the top of that saturated zone that can be at various depths. And above that is typically this unsaturated zone that might be moist soil, but it's not groundwater per se. So an aquifer is that saturated zone. You've probably heard that term a lot. And that's a really important concept. And it's the aquifer that moves water really slowly from the highest parts of our watershed to the lowest parts. And guess what the lowest part of our watershed is the river channel. So just think of our watershed as this big sponge that's slowly draining underground towards the river. And that's groundwater. Oops, my button's right yet. Interestingly enough, of the liquid fresh water on Earth, so we're not counting about the icebergs, the liquid fresh water, 99% of it is groundwater. So it's not like this thing that's like not very important. And yet we think of it that way, right? Because we can't see it. We're always talking about Lake Mead and Lake Powell, but are we really thinking about places where groundwater is being depleted or is becoming scarce? We really don't, because we don't see it. It's very complicated to understand. But about 30% of the stream flow in our rivers actually is derived from groundwater. And that's kind of a national large average. Some places are more, some places are less. But if you like surface water in rivers, you gotta appreciate groundwater's role in that. So what's our challenge here in terms of water? It's this balance in how, we don't really have surface water for human water supplies, right? We don't have big reservoirs and big diversion ditches off the river for water. So people depend entirely on groundwater, and balancing that water need between Fort Huachuca and all of our local communities and people that use water, including you and I, and the water in our classes if it wasn't a bottle from somewhere else. That is all the same water that the San Pedro depends on. And so a lot of the work that we've done over the years is try to figure out, well, how much water does that ecosystem need, when and where, to stay healthy, right? Because we know we're using water, and we want to find a way to balance human needs with the ecosystem. So this is kind of an interesting slide. And the thing I don't like about it is that it portrays the groundwater as like this underground lake, which again, remember, it's not solid water, right? It's the pores of rock and soil that's full of water. But this is a simplistic diagram, is what I'm saying. But it does show the aquifer up on top. It shows a natural watershed that would have an aquifer that all the water that comes into that aquifer from the mountains and precipitation, basically over time is discharged downstream out of the aquifer into rivers, wetlands, and different systems, natural places, systems like that. But it's interesting because every time we pump, when we start to insert wells into this aquifer and we start to pump water out, that's that much less water that could go downstream to those natural systems. And in the middle illustration there, it's labeled safe yield. So safe yield is a legal term in Arizona, which pertains to places like Phoenix and Tucson, where they're actively managing groundwater. And basically the word safe yield means you don't pump out any more water in a given year than flows into the aquifer. So, you don't, it's just like money in the bank, right? You don't withdraw more than you deposit. But guess what? If you take all of that water out that's coming into the system every year naturally, what kind of outflow is left for nature? None, right? So, safe yield, I don't like that term. It's safe for people, it's not safe for rivers, because it almost ensures that you're going to take all the water that could have been available for either purpose, and it puts it basically all in human use. So what we're trying to do here is some kind of a balance between the water that we use and remaining some kind of outflow to sustain nature and the San Pedro and the wonderful habitats that water supports there. And it's a very complicated and interesting pursuit. We're just going to hit the highlights of it today. But I wanted to start with talking about, well, how much water do we have and where relative to the river, and how would we know? So Priscilla mentioned the wet-dry mapping project. This is what results from that volunteer effort every year, and it's hard to see, I'm sure, from a distance, but this is actually a map of the entire watershed from its headwaters, and I don't like the pointer, so I'm just going to skip it. The headwaters in Mexico, here's the international border. Interestingly enough, water comes off the backside of the Huachucas on the west side, flows into Mexico, and then actually flows back into the U.S. So this is the headwater area of the watershed. Here we are with the National Riparian Conservation Area from the border all the way up here to St. David in that area. I-10 you can see going across, and then the San Pedro keeps going all the way down to Tequila. There's some very magnificent tributaries that come off of the San Pedro, Aravaipa, different places along the way that we also map. So we don't map just the main stem of the river, but also the tributaries. And what basically the volunteers do is they walk down the river, and there's people in this room that have done this, walk down the river with a GPS unit, and every time the water starts, you click the GPS, and you keep walking until the water stops, and you click the GPS again. And those data are all rolled up into, and this is like hundreds of people that it takes to get this done. And all that data is rolled up, and a map is produced every year, and has been produced every year for 24 years. And next year is a quarter century. So we're really excited about actually making it to the 25-year mark. And what's interesting is that, when you look at the overall map, you can see, it's hard to tell, really in detail what's going on, but we have much more detailed maps for each reach. Some of these areas weren't mapped. The only places that don't have either red or blue are areas where we did not get permission to access the property to do this work. And we haven't created maps for 2022 yet. It takes us probably until about October every year, even though we map in June to produce the maps. So all we have is 21 data to talk about today. But the 21 data, which is shown here on this map, and the statistics on the left, are frankly the driest year we've seen. So 2021 was kind of a scary year. The main stem overall, 22% of it was mapped. So that means the 29 miles out of the 132 that we mapped on the main stem. That was the lowest number that we've seen, I believe, for the whole river. 2020, in comparison, 38% of it was wet. So the big difference between 38% of a flowing river and only 22%, right? On the tributaries, it was the same kind of a situation, where it was also less than the year before, and 24% the tributaries, and it was 39 more. So all these maps, if you're really interested in getting into any of the details, are all posted at azconservation.org, which is a Nature Conservancy website, and you can look at them again at different scales, different years, and we'll talk about a couple different ways to look at the data today, just for this is going to be the tricky part. This is actually a YouTube video, which I think might work. This is about wet-dry mapping. Which I have to do something over here. There you go.
Today we're here as volunteers working with the Nature Conservancy and the Bureau of Land Management doing what we call the wet-dry mapping. Mapping exactly where there's flow in the river and where there isn't.
So what you do is you start your reach, you identify the conditions at the start of your mapping, you'll identify the water conditions at the end of that, mark those as well with your GPS.
12R 057.
And then basically you provide that data back to those who are the compilers.
We map the river every year, and we map it in the same weekend every year, right before the monsoon rains start. So if we compare that same time every year, we can see over many years how it's changing or not. We started the wet-dry mapping project because we had a lot of questions about how much water really remained in the river during the driest time of the year. And a lot of people had different opinions about that. Some people said that the river flowed constantly, and other people said it was dry all the time. And so we thought we would go out and map it and see where it really did flow during the driest time of the year.
And it serves as a wildlife corridor. It's a migration route for perhaps millions of birds going north and south each year. It's also the last undammed river in the southwestern U.S.
There's been a lot of concern about the San Pedro in terms of it continuing to flow, and that's why we want to know where it does flow all the time. And we're also doing projects to ensure that those flows remain and that hopefully we can improve flows where they've diminished in certain areas.
You know, over the years we've had a lot of different people participate, young and old, but they all seem to have one thing in common, and that is a concern for the environment. And I think we all see a value in these surveys providing data points on the health of the river.
I think it's very hard for people to care about things that they personally don't know. And that's why I feel it's so important to have a citizen science project like this that gets people out and seeing the river and understanding what it looks like and why it's important firsthand. The minds and hearts of people matter too, and getting exposure to how important this place is, there's just nothing like it.
Well, and I'm so grateful that you guys have had exposure this week through the festival, so this is great. Okay, let's see if I can get back onto slides.
Great video.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Could have got different actors though.
Yeah, well, you know. Okay.
Oh, I thought you had pictures.
Not good, too cute.
Close this. What do I
Try to
do? Maybe
stay-
just click on the right part. Next, I like next. Okay, good. Okay, just a list of all the partners that help with this. Obviously, there's a lot of citizen scientists as well, but there's also a lot of agencies. And these are agencies from both countries that coordinate and help provide support in different ways. The effort started off with just the BLM and the Nature Conservancy, has really expanded to a really large group of different entities. And I think it just raises the awareness of all these folks every year about how much water is in the river. This shows how many miles are mapped every year. Back in '99, we mapped the Spurka, and we were like hoping that maybe we could do that again sometime. And it turned out that like people wanted to do it every year, and so it just kind of kept going. And so it started out as less than 50 miles, and now it's been around 300. We had some setbacks. Obviously, the pandemic was really challenging. There's been cartel problems in Mexico that made it hard some years. We've had interesting weather, like weird, storms that came early and different things but every year it just seems to keep going. And like I said, I hope next year we make it to 25. This is an interesting graphic that we call the barcode. So here's the National Riparian Conservation Area. You can see the blue part of the river where the water was persistent in 21. What we did was we were interested to see what's the trend over time. So if you basically take that river channel and just straighten it out and then compare it from 1999, 2000, 2001, every year across, you can see where the fragmentation, how it changes over time or not. And so this is obviously a really long wetted reach, and that is the longest wetted reach of the entire river. So that's a really important area. This area just downstream of the border is one that we're very concerned about. You can see how there was a lot more of the wet, which is the blue, and it's kind of fading out into less and less blue over time, very clearly there. And this is the kind of information that's useful to know where we can do projects to improve water availability. And the project we'll talk about, actually, I don't think I do have any slides about it, but there's a project plan for that specific reach, using treated effluent to recharge the regional aquifer to support the river better there from Bisbee. So that's how we start to get a handle of where do we need projects, where are we seeing the fragmentation trends that look the worst over time, and that's certainly one of them. Oops, sorry. Not yet. This is another really interesting statistic, which just shows, again, this is just within the riparian conservation area, the number of wet miles that we mapped. And you can see that there's, it's not like it's, just going downhill, but there's a lot of variation. And those years that had a lot of wet miles were usually the June after a good monsoon the summer before. So that's how much the monsoon impacts flows. If this good monsoon this year, I suspect that we're gonna see good flows next June, months later, because those flood flows really help to recharge the aquifer, the floodplain. But the other thing that I don't like about this graphic is that if you look at 21, it's the lowest dot since the beginning of mapping. So that's worrisome for sure. I put the bear track in there because on the years that are super dry, we see a lot of wildlife activity on those wetted beaches. And so the folks that are out there mapping, particularly on the dry years, give us all kinds of accounts of, the wildlife and or their evidence around these remaining wet stretches. And it just goes to show that those years, the water is the most important, right? Even though there's the least of it. So we are really hoping that due to what's happening out there right now, the next dot is going to be up. Yeah. We're hoping.
So this is a good monsoon now, in your opinion?
In my opinion, it is. It started early. It's been kind of on and off, but overall pretty darn good. We've had some huge flows, and especially down in Sonora. Sometimes I live just about 4 miles downstream of the international border, and lots of times it won't even be raining at my house, but we'll, have the black wall in Sonora, and we'll just hear these big flood pulses come through. And this has been a really good year for that. So let's talk about water management and what we're doing to try to sustain the flows. I talk about partnerships because water management is a really complex issue, right? It affects everybody, and there's so many different agencies, and there's legal context, and there's all kinds of complexity about managing an aquifer that's a shared, basically, pool of water that we all depend on, right? So the very first thing that happened in terms of partnerships and people coming together to try to find some common understanding of the issues was the Upper San Pedro Partnership, which is on the upper left there. It's actually 21 different member agencies, and it's everybody from federal agencies, including the BLM and others, to state agencies, local municipalities, counties, the Nature Conservancy, Audubon. There's all kinds of folks involved in the Upper San Pedro Partnership, and it really has been working pretty steadily since 1998 to create the science that can inform our water management. And it was that coming together of trying to understand what was going on that led to this effort on the right called the Cochise Conservation and Recharge Network of doing projects based on the science, right? So again, I showed you where that reach by Mexico where the flows were fragmenting. Well, that's the kind of information, along with other stuff that was generated from the partnership, that came together, and people said, well, let's do something. What can we do? And so there's, we'll talk about the projects of it's called the CCRN a little bit today. Most recently, there's been an agreement, a memorandum of understanding created for the SPRNCA. And this is just another level of complexity, but it's basically a voluntary agreement between Fort Huachuca, the BLM, Cochise County, and the city of Sierra Vista to do ongoing monitoring and to take that monitoring information and have it drive basically management decisions amongst that group. And so we're not going to talk much about it today because it's like a 30-page MOU. We don't want to go there. But I just tell you that all these things kind of interact with one another, right? How we're going to manage it, who's going to do the projects, where's the science. And so we try to vet the science through the Upper San Pedro Partnership, where we get the brightest minds to kind of think through, these complicated questions about the water. So the first question that the Upper San Pedro Partnership addressed as a group is they built what's called a groundwater model, which is a predictive model of how the groundwater levels are going to change. And if you kind of do nothing, this was kind of the take-home message, is that this shows different levels of groundwater in different colors, the darkest colors being the deepest groundwater. So it shows that those pumping centers where we all live and work, play, and where we use the most water, by 2075, that groundwater table would drop pretty severely over a very large area if we weren't to take very proactive measures. So this is some of the stuff that kind of got people thinking about what can be done and really starting to implement things that can change. Yeah.
Can you give me a perspective on that map? What's that cover? Is that,
Oh, I'm sorry,
like,
yeah.
where's Sierra Vista?
Yeah, there's Huachuca City there.
Okay.
Here's Palominas here. Here's the international border here.
Okay.
There's, and here's the riparian national conservation area. It's really kind of hard to see there. Yeah. So this is a really big watershed scale. These are the Huachuca Mountains over here. And it's just showing in the valley bottom how deep the groundwater gets if you do basically nothing.
How do they know?
What's that?
How do they know?
So what this does, this is a predictive model that is calibrated with real life information, right? It's told all these different variables of how much groundwater is out there right now based on all the wells and the monitoring of all the information that we have about stream flow. And it takes all that information and it's a predictive model just like a weather forecast, think of it like that. And so you can ask it, okay, so if we pump this much in this many places, and we do these certain things, what will it look like by 2075? This is like your weather forecast for 2075 for groundwater. And there's a lot of information that goes into these models.
There's kind of a little round area down at the very bottom there.
Right there?
Yeah, do you know what accounts for that being there?
I do. So this actually is a kind of leftover from a lot of the agricultural pumping that happened down in Palominas. Was a little bit more of an agricultural area that had some very high volume pumping historically. And what's interesting is over time, when you look at the model, because the agriculture has mostly been, the irrigated ag has mostly been retired, a lot of that starts to come back over time. This is more about our residential and municipal uses over time by 2075, given population projections and a lot more people, a lot more pumping. This is kind of the worst case scenario of oops, I'm sorry. So one of the biggest projects that got done early on to try to address this groundwater situation was the City of Sierra Vista's Environmental Operations Park. So all of the water that we use in town goes to the EOP, pretty much all of it, there's some exceptions, but most of it goes down to this Environmental Operations Park. Have people birded there? Anybody birded? Yeah, there's some nice wetlands there. So that was actually constructed in 2002, at least the recharge part of that, where the water was put back into the aquifer. And that has created a very large area where the groundwater has risen due to that. And it was frankly pretty important is setting kind of a proof of concept kind of project, right? That how much good could a facility like that do? And at the time, this was based on some of the modeling, just like the we did nothing modeling I showed you before. So people had an idea that this would help, and it helped, frankly, a lot in a really important place. But one project is not going to solve the problem. And so it did start to suggest that we needed additional projects that would do similar things in other locations. And that's what we've been working on among some other stuff. So we'll talk about all those things. This is another map for you of the National Riparian Conservation Area. And this little square right here is actually the Environmental Operations Park. But that conservation and recharge network that I was talking to you about now has several projects all along the river, starting with a stormwater project down here on the Lab Ranch. In Palominas, there's another stormwater recharge project. We retired irrigated agriculture in this area. There's basically there was, let's see, 3 huge subdivisions, which I think were pretty much all platted, that went bankrupt back in the big land bubble time and became available for acquisition at just the right places to do some of this kind of aquifer recharge. So this one was a subdivision planned in Palominas that's now the stormwater project. Riverstone is 1,800 acres. It was a planned subdivision which has been permanently retired and will be part of an effluent project in the nearest future. This Bella Vista was a very large 3,000 acre development that was also permanently retired. So there's been a lot of reduced pumping near the river in terms of the future pumping that can occur, which is good. And those are the places that we're trying to do more recharge. It's kind of like the EOP. We also have some projects up on the Bapa Kamari. That's another really important place.
Wait, when did the Bella Vista stuff, when was that acquired and retired?
So I'm trying to remember when the big land bubble thing happened. It was like 2010,
2008.
2008.
Yeah.
And we never thought we could buy those.
Yeah, I hadn't heard that. That is great news.
We never thought we could buy it, but I mean, it went into bankruptcy,
Sweet.
and we in fact, bankruptcy too.
Sweet.
So all these properties the Nature Conservancy acquired, and I will add with
Nature Conservancy.
yes. We acquired it, but the only reason we could afford to do it is because we got funding from DOD and Fort Huachuca.
And they can act fast, you guys.
Yeah, exactly, yep. And so what we did was we purchased these properties, we put permanent conservation easements on them, we retained those easements which said there cannot be large scale development, there cannot be large volume pumping forever and ever. We did transfer them to Cochise County for their long-term operation and maintenance. And so that's why they're going to be part of these recharge projects.
Cochise County owns them?
Yes.
Cochise County.
They own them, but we retain the conservation easement. So
Okay.
just like, you know, a lot of times conservation easements are on private lands, these conservation easements are on kind of semi-public lands. And I have to tell you that it was so interesting because these conservation easements, you know, they're all about no pumping, no development, but they do allow for like effluent recharge. And I don't think there's ever been a conservation easement that has had to contemplate the kinds of things that we did for these, right? We were like, well, we do want to be able to like recharge stormwater and do things that will benefit the aquifer. So they're very unusual conservation easements that are really focused around water and managing the aquifer. So yeah, you should know that because that's kind of near you.
I've been out of the loop.
Yeah, I mean,
That is like super duper news.
well,
I
and
expected Bella Vista to be, you know, doing houses all the way down to where I live.
well, and what is so amazing about this effort is that, you know, everybody was supportive of this project. The city, the developer, everybody was on board with us getting this together. And it's because they were around the table thinking about the science with the Upper San Pedro Partnership for 15 years that they understood why these locations were, I mean, you know, I talked about how the groundwater levels from this recharge project had improved like for miles around. Well, it turns out that the groundwater levels, almost this entire property benefits in terms of raised groundwater from that other project. What if we had raised the groundwater on one project just to sell it to developer if it had developed, right, next door? So yeah, it's pretty amazing.
Holly,
Uh-huh.
I have a question about Carr Canyon where I live.
Yeah,
The creek is not flowing and hasn't flowed in 2 or 3 years now. And of course, Ramsey is flowing like crazy and Miller and so forth. So is it being blocked or something by Tombstone or?
so the waterfall's flowing, right?
The waterfall is flowing,
Yeah,
but I'm like the second house up from the highway.
and it all goes underground.
And yeah, there's nothing. It's very dry.
Yeah. So the way our natural recharge works is it's called mountain front recharge, right? And so it's
Right.
those big stream channels like Carr and Ramsey where most of the water from the higher elevations comes down and sinks into the aquifer.
Right.
And that the the channels are so dry that it's a dry sponge, right?
It's
So
what?
think of the beds in those channels as dry sponges that
Okay,
haven't had a lot of rain for a couple of years. I mean,
we've had a lot of rain,
or put it this way, how
Not
has it
last year.
flowed the last couple of years in the,
not very well.
there you go, yep. So
I
what it
mean,
is,
if at all, this year, nothing,
and
and we're getting all kinds of rain.
it's because the ground is so dry. And we are seeing these at all these different sites where we do a lot of monitoring.
And some of the oaks are still, they're not coming back.
It's a lagged response of year after year of drought. When the
I
rain
see.
finally comes back, it has to fill all that dry sponge before it starts
Okay.
flowing down. And this is really important because we've seen this at these projects where we're like, wow, we should be getting all kinds of runoff, and we weren't. And it was because we have realized that this is an impact of climate change, is that once you start getting dry soils, the runoff, the rainfall runoff relationship is very different.
I think it's been different since the 2011 fire, more or less. I mean, at first it was fine, but within the last 3 or 4 or 5 years, it's been less and less, and this year and last year, it's not flowing at all. And there's 5 different channels between, like, Car Canyon Road. We're very near Car Canyon Road right there, and the people that live sort of 5 channels over, and they're all dry.
No, we're seeing this everywhere.
Okay.
And it's gonna take, successive years of good rain, and gradually that, they call it the subflow in these channels, right? It's the water in the bed of the channel will refill enough that you'll get water back in the surface.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Because it's
Well, what you're describing is, isn't that like the whole Colorado River shed? It's the same thing. It's the ground's so dry that what moisture is coming down is getting sucked up before it ever gets down to the impoundments, right?
Yeah, I mean, this is a reality of extended drought, is that, and this is the thing about hydrologic systems, right, is there's so much complexity between groundwater and surface water, and it's all connected. And all we see is the surface water, and we're asking questions like you, where's the surface water? Oops, we didn't have any of that storage in the channel, and the groundwater beneath it to sustain it, to keep flowing. So,
my well, I think, is okay. I'm on a well. I also have a little frog pond, which are called leopard frogs. That's fine. But, the channels aren't.
yeah, and the thing about groundwater is it's just a matter of time when these changes occur, so I would keep an
Thank you.
eye
That
on your
answers-
well.
Appreciate it.
I'd sort of like to share the serendipitous chain of events that came about that we could acquire the Palominas Reserve. We share the fence right beside that development. And it was it was changed to high density probably 20 years ago. So 285 acres was supposed to be over 300 little housing units. And a floodplain runs through the middle of that. So there's some high, some low, whatever. But they got their housing development permit to go through, just as they say, the wind doesn't always blow poorly, because that housing development, except for those folks, they went bankrupt when the housing market crashed. And so they could not pay, and it went into receivership. Well, they were purchased by a company out of Philadelphia who picked it up on pennies on the dollar for what it was developed. So that guy, the representative, was out here checking out the property. He was visiting around the area, and I got a call from one of the planners from Cochise County Planning Office, and she said, I know you've been concerned about that piece of property. I just want to let you know that the company that now owns it is here seeing the property. Would you mind if I gave him your phone number in case he wants to swing by and see it? I said, no, that'd be okay if you did that. So he called us, he came over, My husband took him over into that piece of property. You should have seen this guy in his three-piece suit climbing through the barbed wire and where the cows were in the field out there. And he walked him through saying, this is the floodplain. This is 6 feet higher, and this thing has houses built on this 6 feet higher. This is not an appropriate piece of property for a housing development. It's gonna be problems come in there. So he said, oh, well, we were thinking this was flat land and we would just sell it for a housing area. He said, no, I agree, this isn't a good place to build it. But he said, we knew previously what they were asking for this piece of property for a housing development. And it was something like 2.5 million or something like that for it as a housing area. He says, we'd have to, I don't know, we'd sell it, but we'd have to have, I don't know, 800,000 or 750,000 for it. We went, okay. He left, I got immediately on the phone to Holly. He said that they could go as high as that. I think you called your negotiator in Tucson who does the negotiating. He made arrangements with the guy, met him at the airport before he even flew back. He met him at the Tucson airport, and before we knew it, that chain of events that started with the city planner had the Nature Conservancy able to acquire that piece of property. And it was just a serendipitous chain of events that planner thought to call us, and we could take the guy over there and he would walk through that property, and it was meant to be. It was meant to fall into place that we could get that piece of property there.
It takes a village. So thanks for the role you played.
Yes.
It was a critical link, obviously.
Yeah, there were several critical links. We were dealing minutes. We could get you, and you got that guy in minutes. They could meet him at the airport before his flight took off, and it was meant to be. It just fell into place.
Well, again, these are really unusual projects because usually the Nature Conservancy buys these really high quality habitats and sets them aside. And I think, it's a nice piece of property and it has a lot of water on it. There's no real natural channel, but it's all the sheet flow and it has a lot of water. And so again, it was like trying to convince the Nature Conservancy that this was a conservation priority. It was like, what? Layman's love grass?
And you have to decide in 20 minutes.
So we are thinking about things differently these days in terms of water and processes that support the really important habitats, not just buying the habitats themselves. So yeah. And I walk the trail now behind your house.
Yeah, right.
It's now, it does have a little hiking trail on it. So anyway, back to what this was about. This shows again the National Riparian Conservation Area, this time in green, and it shows these different recharge and conservation sites. And it's color coded to different kinds of source water for recharge. That's either stormwater, Horseshoe Draw, Palominas. Coyote Wash is an interesting one. That's the Bella Vista property. It's right next to the Environmental Operations Park. That one is the biggest drainage coming out of the city of Sierra Vista. So you know what cities do when they're built? Is all of a sudden you take a grassland that has soil or water can infiltrate, and you pave it, put rooftops, put sidewalks, put parking lots, and all of a sudden all this water comes crashing off of an urban place. I mean, that's what happens. And that's why we have floodplain managers, right? And all that they do to try to mitigate flood risk. Well, we thought that's the perfect place to have a recharge property, is to capture all that urban runoff and slow it down from running right into the river, but try to get it back into the aquifer where the water quality can improve moving through the aquifer and the groundwater towards the river. So that's another really important reason for the Bella Vista acquisition, is that it had the most stormwater runoff of the area.
I know about Coyote Wash.
Yeah. Well, do you know where the gravel pit is?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's going to be the recharge basin.
Really?
Yeah.
Sweet.
Yeah. So what we're going to do is, and this is part of the science that we created, is we're going to divert just enough water into that gravel pit to slow it down during big peaks, and then slowly release it back to the channel so that it can infiltrate into the channel. But we've quantified how much extra water from the urbanization to do that with. So
What's your timeline to completion?
it'll probably be another year, something like that. Year and a half. Okay, this was the beginning of the monsoon this year. It was really fun. real picture didn't change it. Okay, what we're learning. So this is the property that I mentioned we retired some irrigation that was down in that Palominas area where you pointed out that there was that other little red blob on the forecast map that showed there was going to be depletion down in Palominas. This was some of it before center pivots that used to be there. And this is actually well data on the right from a landowner that lives in between where the pumping was. So the river's right over here. It's hard to tell from the photo. Actually, you can see the channel there. So somebody had a well on their property about right here. And this is the depth to water in their well. And this red line shows in the summer, so it's obviously always a little, deeper in the summer than in the winter is the blue line. But basically, this is, so his well was, not that deep before this irrigation began. And this is the year the irrigation began. And look what happened to his well. So between here and here, the irrigation was occurring. And then the property was acquired and another conservation easement put on that property that basically precluded any high volume pumping. And look what happened, the depth in his well went back to before the ag field. So that was a really interesting, because he is about a mile away from the actual well. But like I said, right next to the river. So you can imagine what impact that would have on a cottonwood tree, right? And their ability to reach water or wildlife. So this is just a slide that talks about the importance of floodplain protection and making sure that the existing floodplain stays open for these wonderful monsoon floods to come screaming through and for that water to have a chance to sink back in and re-wet the dry soils in the floodplain. And I'm going to guess how to get this to work. This is a little video. Looking across the San Pedro, so this is how wide it is during the flood flows. I don't know if it was like this when you saw it. But, when people laugh at the little San Pedro, I just kind of chuckle about quite the mighty river in its own right. It's really fun to see it like this. But that is another part of this whole regional effort and these projects is to make sure that, particularly like in the Baba Kamari, there was a lot of development proposals right in the floodplain. And so that was a real effort was to buy some of those parcels and just leave the floodplain open and make sure that they don't become developed.
Oh, can you hear it from your house?
Oh, yeah. This is actually monitoring at the Baba Kamari, where we installed a groundwater well at that conservation protection project. And what it shows is these are flood peaks, so this is stream flow. And you can see there's different little flood peaks over time. The red line is the depth to water, and so, but the scales are different, right? So think of this as like the ground surface, right? So this is like 35 feet below the ground surface, and this is 50 feet below the ground surface. But see how the water table jumps up with these flood flows, and then slowly comes back down, and then jumps back up? That's all about that dry sponge filling up with water from the floods that seep into the aquifer. So all that good stuff is happening right now. Couldn't be happier about that. And certainly beaver dams have a role in this too. And we have not as much monitoring information about this in terms of the water, but we do know that even those smaller kind of what we call base flow during the dry times of the year, they're slowed down by beaver dam. And that water still comes back into the aquifer and recharges those stream banks and is really important. And so thankfully BLM reintroduced the beaver in 99. And I know that they're doing a lot of monitoring right now.
And they're not doing well, the beavers.
Yeah. Well, Watershed Management Group, did you see their presentation?
Absolutely, I'm actually working with them on a beaver project.
Cool, yeah. I'm glad they're doing that, because we
Yeah.
really need to know what's happening with those guys. Okay, here is I just want to show you one picture of a stormwater recharge basin. This had an amazingly huge head cut going up Horseshoe Draw, where the erosion was just eating back in the channel upstream, and there was this like cliff in the channel, and all this sediment was coming crashing down into the San Pedro. And so the Arizona Department of Environmental Quality wanted to see some kind of a sediment control project there. And so this basin was constructed, but it also serves as a recharge facility, because what happens is the water in Horseshoe Draw comes in, and then is slowed down, just like we were talking about for Coyote Wash, and slowly released. And so we have monitoring that shows how much water, how the water levels rise, and how much infiltration is happening where. And anyway, the bottom line to this one, which is pretty cool, is colors are horrible. But the red is how much recharge occurred in that big basin, but more importantly, look at all this additional recharge that occurs in the channel downstream of the basin. And that's because what it does is it slows down the water, and it slowly releases it to the channel, so the channel has time for it to sink in. And we see all this additional water. These are 3 different years, 2019, 2020, and 2021.
Where is Horseshoe Draw?
So Horseshoe Draw is on private lands south of Highway 92. So relatively near the international border. And it flows out of Mexico. And it comes off of Sierra San Jose. So it actually has a lot of water, because the mountain Sierra San Jose is right there. And so it's another almost kind of mountain front recharge kind of area. But we were really interested to see that, and this kind of gets into this whole idea of natural infrastructure, and we've been working with natural infrastructure approaches, is that the natural channels do a really good job at recharging the aquifer if you just slow the water down a little bit. So these are just some of the lessons learned that I wanted to kind of wrap up with. I hope you all go away with an increased awareness of groundwater beneath your feet all the time. And that it's unseen and undervalued, and yet really increasingly important, especially as surface water supplies dwindle. And a lot of the predictive models and the monitoring can really help us understand how these things work together, and help us to better balance the environmental water needs with human water demands. It's getting increasingly challenging, for sure, especially as we get more people and less water. So we really need to take a long-term perspective and try to look out into the future in terms of both climate and water supply. There's still so much uncertainty about this, and models are only as good as the assumptions that you put into them. And I will say that the weather forecasts give modeling a really bad name. I think the groundwater models have to be better than the weather forecasts. Because I don't think I'd still have a job if these models were as bad as those. I don't know. I just don't get how the weather people come out being wrong so much. But the bottom line, I feel, is that we really need to obviously increase the awareness, desire, and capacity to connect science with policy, and to demonstrate some of these things that do work, that do help, and make things better for nature and people. They usually take, frankly, large investments, and that's, I think, one of the big bottlenecks, is getting the funding. I'm really hopeful now with the infrastructure funding that's coming down the pipe, that maybe some of that can help us with some of these projects.
That's one thing Kristen is doing well.
Yeah, he's definitely tracking that.
Kristen Cinema.
Oh, Kristen.
Wonderful.
I'm talking about somebody I worked with called Kristen, who's tracking government relations and
that was
money.
wonderful.
Sorry.
One of the things she did to put her stamp on it was to put a lot of drought money to help drought in Arizona, so funding should come. That just came out last couple of days.
Yeah. I know the water, WIFA, the Water Infrastructure Financing Authority, has been given a lot more money than they've ever had before. And it used to only be loans, and now it's grants. So.
Maybe they can turn on the winter rains.
Yeah. Other questions? Things that we went through a lot, I know.
I'll just say, great talk.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I have a question.
Very good.
Let's give Holly a hand.
For projects like the Horseshoe Draw project, where you're kind of just like dredging in that ephemeral wash that's tied to the San Pedro, is there 404 Clean Water Act permits required, or is it unconnected? How does that work?
Yeah, there's a lot of permitting required for these projects for sure, and every one of them is a little different. But you know, some of them require aquifer protection permits and acidities permits and 404 permits and all those kinds of things. And so that's why it takes many years, frankly, to pull off one of these projects, because first of all, we have to do the science to determine where it's needed to help the river the most and figure out the design. But then, like you mentioned, there's multiple kinds of permitting that sometimes can be very expensive in terms of the engineering. And so, you know, this is no small feat to invest in these projects. And yet, you know, the thing that is really heartening is that when agencies come together and people come together and work together, you can do the heavy lift. I mean, it's just like your story with Palominas, right? I mean, that's what it takes. It takes a village of people working together. Only way. Yeah.
Well, I was just curious, with it being called the Cochise Conservation and Recharge Network, are there plans of expanding to any of the other watersheds in the county at some point? Or is it just focused on the San Pedro?
You know, there haven't been conversations about that because we've been kept pretty busy. But I said that's probably a good question for the county someday, right? That would be a priority for them. And by the way, there are websites for the Cochise Conservation and Recharge Network that go through every project in great detail. And there's also, on their website, they have an annual report and a news feed about all these projects. So for those of you that are familiar with any one or the other of them and want to know what's going on, basically just visit the website, get the annual reports, and there's some really interesting information. Palominas facility has all kinds of instrumentation and monitoring still that's very interesting. So we're learning a lot, and I tried not to get too geeky today because I could talk about all this stuff that we're monitoring. It gets into a lot of data, and then kind of you can't really get through it very quick.
How do you measure, you had one thing where there were well levels, okay, well depth. How do you measure that? How do you measure well depth?
So we use monitoring wells, and they have these things.
So you drilled specially?
Yeah, now you can actually utilize production wells for that purpose, but you don't want to use them as a monitoring well if you're pumping, you know, it kind of messes up the signal.
Yeah.
But you can use old supply wells as monitoring wells. Yeah. But you can also install them strictly as monitoring wells. So we kind of have a combination of those. And then the folks like the USGS have really sophisticated equipment where they can just shoot down and see if they have like sounders that will say what's the depth and all kinds of sophisticated ways to figure out how far it is down there. So yeah, and so I encourage all of you to go out and see the river, and you know, get involved in any ways that you can, for sure. Wet dry mapping, letting people wet dry map on your property, whatever. I know there's lots of folks in this room that have done a lot of things, so thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.